Thanks everyone for making the time to come on tonight. And I see that while the majority are from Northern Australia, there are a few from some of the southern states. So a lot of my presentation will be Northern Australia centric, but the basic principles nutrition for weaners apply across the board. And I'd also like to thank both Caitlin and Jed and Daph and Future Beef for inviting me to come in and present this webinar. So when we talk about early weaning, we just need to be clear that everybody has the same understanding of what early weaning is. So if we say that a normal weaner is approximately 150 kg, and there's obviously going to be variation around that depending on what sort of country those calves are weaned on, and also the breed of cattle that are being run. We're referring to an animal that has a fully functional rumen and digestive system to be able to live on a pasture-based diet and requires very little nutritional assistance. So obviously when animals are in drought, they're going to be requiring considerable assistance. Lighter calves are going to require much more assistance, and those we refer to as early weaners. The idea of early weaning is to reduce the nutritional stress on the breeder. So the timing of our weaning should relate to what the body condition score is of the breeder and trying to maintain that. So before embarking on a weaning program, we really need to think about how long it will be until there's an actual likely break in the season. So when are we likely to get our green date and a response to rainfall where there's sufficient pasture available? How long is the feeding program likely to last, and what is it going to cost us, and what are some of the alternatives if it is going to become a costly exercise and the prognosis isn't good and the feeding period is considerable? What is the goal in the end point for those early weaners? What are we trying to achieve? What sort of weight gains are we trying to achieve with those early weaners? How much availability of roughage and energy supplements are there? And there have been massive shortages across the country with respect to energy commodities and good quality hay, and it's really added to the costs of feeding. What will it cost in roughage and supplements to actually feed each animal? So those are some of the things we're going to explore as we go along. So some of the benefits, just to briefly cover off on the breeder side of things, the benefits of weaning are to maintain breeder body condition score. And basically what we're doing is maintaining that ovarian function of the breeder. So we're actually allowing her to prepare for the next pregnancy, not the current pregnancy if she does happen to be in calf, while she does have a calf at foot at the time of weaning. It also reduces postpartum anestrus, the postpartum anestrus period for breeders, and particularly first calf cows, because they're our problem group in terms of getting good reconception rate. So they're very sensitive to lactational anestrus, and particularly Bos indicus-based cattle are very sensitive to lactational anestrus. So removing calves will allow those females to cycle, provided they're in reasonable body condition. It also means that more nutrients can be directed to the fetus and ensure a much more viable calf weight, so we get a reduction in neonatal and perinatal losses, which the Cash Cow project identified as being quite considerable. So I wanted to show you a graph that I'd put together looking at the different the energy requirements at different stages of production for the breeder. So if we look at the first bar in the histogram on the far left, we can see that a breeder's energy requirements when she's dry and empty are below 60 megajoules, but when she's at peak lactation, 8 to 10 weeks lactation, she's actually going to be in peak lactation, and her energy requirements are going to be, so once she hits her, you can see that they're almost double what they are when she's empty. So removing that calf takes considerable nutritional stress off that cow, and we can move to a situation where she may or may not need assistance. And the other thing that probably haven't considered also is when she's got a calf at foot, her water requirements are going to be considerably higher then they would be running the two animals individually. So we've got inefficiencies in milk production, and in times where people have limited water or relying on surface water during a drought, that can actually have a massive impact as well. So the benefits to the breeders with early weaning, it means we can delay the start of supplementation, particularly having to supplement energy to breeders, which is quite considerable. It also means that quite possibly those breeders might just require a urea-based protein supplement and not an energy supplement, or many may require no supplement at all. So that allows us to focus our supplementation on the weaners rather than the breeders. The challenges with the early weaners are that initially we need to develop the rumen function quickly. The idea of feeding that calf is to actually get that calf ready to be able to handle fibrous feeds out in the paddock, and that allows us to feed that animal much more cost effectively if it's relying more heavily on the pasture out in the paddock. So we want to develop rumen function quickly, and I'll talk about that in a lot more detail, and that's going to influence how we manage those animals as well as what we're actually providing to those animals. So they've got quite high nutritional requirements. Early weaners, very high requirements for both protein and energy. They also have minimal gut capacity. So the rumen function isn't completely developed, and it'll be at different stages of development depending on what weight we're actually weaning those calves. And if we have minimal gut capacity coupled with high protein and energy requirements, it requires a lot of consideration in the types of supplements that will actually help them to meet their requirements and also develop rumen function. So they will have limited or no rumen function, and it's the rumen that processes the roughage in the feed. Without that rumen function, cattle and sheep wouldn't have the ability to actually process fibrous feed, and that actually allows the processing of those feeds actually provides those animals with a considerable amount of energy and protein, and I'll discuss that in a bit more detail. So we're wanting to prepare those weaners to be able to handle the pasture conditions as well as supply their immediate protein and energy requirements. So the nutritional considerations are firstly to actually develop the rumen so that they can process pasture, to provide that animal with a roughage source, and one that's palatable and one that can be easily digested because they have limited rumen capacity. Also to develop the microbial population in the gut, so the microbes are the factory workers of the gut that actually convert that roughage into a form of energy and protein that the animal can absorb into their system. And we also need to consider the protein and energy requirements for different classes of weaners. So what a very small weaner requires will be very different to what a normal weaner, and a weaner that might be weighing between 150 and 200 kilograms would require. We also need to think about setting up the supplementation program, ensuring that there's a continuity of feed supply. Wherever we have to chop and change different types of feeds and hays, there's always a risk of having digestive problems, because the rumen has to adjust, and the rumen microbial population has to adjust to a change in diet. And also there are issues potentially with palatability of new feeds that are brought in. We also need to calculate the cost of the feeding program beforehand to see whether there will be a return on the money spent. Managing the program and actually keeping records of how things are working to look at what the return is for the weight gain in those animals is fairly important, so that changes can be made for the following year. And then how those animals are actually transitioned from one weight group into a heavier weight group. And that's fairly important as well in itself, in that the faster we can transition them up to a heavier weight group, the lower our feeding costs are going to be, because the heavier animals don't require as much input. We also need to consider pasture and diet quality when we actually send them out of the yard. So if they're being moved from the yards out into the paddock, they still have the same protein energy requirement. So it's a case of actually determining what the gap is between what the animals require and what the pasture is actually delivering to them. So if we have a look at the digestive system of cattle or sheep, you can see there's the esophagus where the feed first travels down, and it goes into the rumen or reticulum And the rumen is where we have microbial breakdown of the feed. That rumen is non-functional when a calf is young, so it undergoes physiological development to actually set it up to be able to absorb nutrients from the rumen directly into the bloodstream. And so a lot of nutrient absorption occurs from the rumen, and then there are other nutrients that pass through to the abomasum, which is a true stomach, or where there's chemical digestion in the calf, which is very similar to our own stomach. When a calf is young and it's consuming milk and suckling, the suckling reflex actually allows for the diversion of that milk from the esophagus into the abomasum via the omasum, and it bypasses the rumen. But as the calf starts to nibble on pasture at maybe 2 to 3 weeks of age, any solids that animal is consuming goes into the rumen, and that assists with the development of both the rumen and also the microbial population. So if we look at the first diagram on the far left, we can see that in a small calf or in a newborn, the rumen's quite small relative to the abomasum as part of the 4-chambered stomach. Once the calf is 3 to 4 months of age, it's starting to eat considerable roughage, so the rumen will expand. And part of the importance of having the roughage in there is to actually expand that rumen. So when that animal is weaned, it's got significant capacity to actually be able to process a lot of roughage. While it's quite small, when we're early weaning calves, they don't have that rumen capacity to process a lot of feed. And because they have high nutrient requirements, everything we supply to them has to also be high quality. When the animal becomes a mature animal, you can see that the rumen is by far the largest compartment of the gut, and that's because 99% of what they're processing is coming from the pasture. So just to look at that again, in a calf, the rumen only makes up 25% of the capacity of the 4 compartments of the stomach, and the abomasum makes up 70%. And in adult, the abomasum is actually proportionately much smaller than the rumen, and that's because of the change in the diet. So in the rumen, we get the development of the papillae, and they're quite dense on the ventral side of the rumen, and they're responsible for increasing the nutrient absorption through the rumen into the bloodstream. So feeding weaners concentrates such as grains, pellets, and other energy supplements, it actually liberates what we call our volatile fatty acids that specifically allow for the development of those papillae. So they don't just supply the animal with energy and protein, they actually develop the papillae in the rumen to allow for absorption of nutrients. So it makes the animal much more efficient at processing roughage into nutrients and absorbing those into the animal's system. What the hay does, as I mentioned earlier, it allows for the expansion of the rumen to increase its capacity. It also is the key source of energy for the rumen microbes, which are responsible for breaking down that fiber into a form of energy that the animals can utilize. And in turn, those microbes will multiply very rapidly in the gut, and then they're digested further on down in the abomasum, which was that true stomach, and they're actually the main source of protein for the animal. So it's critical that we look after those microbes. We need to have the roughage there to do that. The other thing that the roughage does is it prevents keratin from forming on the papillae. The keratin would actually stop a lot of nutrients from actually being absorbed through the papillae. If we look at the microbes in the gut, we've got bacteria, fungi, and protozoa. So the bacteria are by far the most important bugs in the gut, and they actually adjust. There's about 3,000 species of them in the gut, and they will all break down different types of feeds, and their populations will go up and down in the gut depending on what sort of feeds the animal is eating. So when we transition animals from one feed to another, particularly if it's quite a drastic transition, we need to actually take time to do that to allow the microbial population in the gut to actually adjust to that. Otherwise, we run into problems. In the second slide on the top right, you'll see a red-stained organism. That's a fungus, and they actually increase in numbers as the feed gets dry. They're very good at digesting poor quality feed, which is quite widespread across Australia at the moment. Once there's green feed around, their numbers drop back, and they're in there amongst bacteria. And then on the bottom, you can see there's a couple of really big organisms. Those are protozoa. There are a few species that are beneficial to the animal, but mostly they're parasitic in the gut, and they eat the starch granules from the feed that the animal's consuming in the pasture, and they also eat the other microbes. So the performance of those microbes is going to depend on the rumen ammonia level. So the rumen ammonia level is driven by how much protein there is in the diet. And when protein falls short, we do things like supply protein to the animal via protein meals, or more commonly in the north, we use urea, which is a very cheap source of nitrogen, and it actually lifts up the rumen ammonia level. So none of that urea is directly goes to the animal. It's actually converted in the rumen, and it's a source of nitrogen for the rumen microbes. The other thing it's driven by, microbial function, is the rumen pH, and that's moderated by the feed composition, and in this case it's fibers. So we need to have the fiber in the diet, which the animals will chew, and they'll regurgitate and chew, and there'll be copious amounts of saliva produced in the process. And the saliva contains buffers, which help to regulate and buffer the pH. If you were to feed a grain-based diet with very little fiber, you'd find that the pH of the rumen would drop down, and it would wipe out a considerable number of those rumen microbes. And in the case of acidosis, it can actually shed the papillae in the lining of the rumen. So we do need to have that grass or that fiber in there to actually buffer the pH so it doesn't become acidic. So weaning management in the yards, we need to make sure that animals have access to good quality hay immediately. Small weaners particularly need to have sweet hay to actually attract them to eating it, because they've got very little rumen function. We need to actually develop that quickly, and if they haven't been exposed to hay, then it needs to be made. We need to have hay that's attractive, that they're willing to eat. Better is if we can actually expose them to hay while they're on their mothers in the yard, so that they've got that positive reference to hay when they're brought in for weaning, and they'll come on to it a little bit more quickly. We also need to make sure that animals have access to clean water, and when animals are on grain-based supplements, the water does tend to foul a bit more quickly, so it does need to be cleaned regularly. They also be shedding bacteria and germs from their mouth into the water as well, which is a nice environment for transfer of germs to other animals that are in close proximity, so it's another reason to make sure those troughs stay nice and clean. Animals need to be weighed and then drafted into groups, and weighing is probably preferable to just eyeballing animals to make sure that we get it right, particularly where small weaners are concerned, because their nutritional requirements are so varied and different, so they have to be managed differently. And then they should be put into groups to allow for that strategic, appropriate feeding. So what will feed a small weaner, something that's less than 100 kgs, for example, is going to be very different to what you might feed something that's 150 or 200 kilograms, and certainly a lot more expensive. So we don't want to be feeding the same supplements to older animals as what we're feeding to the smaller animals, because it's not necessary. Some other considerations are what sort of target markets we're actually looking to sell animals to, particularly if weaners are being, animals are being turned off as weaners, so that will govern the rate of growth and the quality of the diet that you might want to provide to them. Once they become depastured, it's important to get a handle on the quality of the diet coming from pasture, and in areas where you have tropical grass-dominated pastures, you can do a fecal NIRS or diet quality test by taking dung samples to determine what the digestibility and crude protein levels are, and that will allow an indication of the contribution of forage to the diet, how much energy and protein those animals are getting, and from there, a supplementation program can be developed to work out what the animals need to be supplemented with to close up that gap between what they require and what the pasture is supplying. And that's what their requirements are will obviously also be based on what level of growth we want to achieve with those animals. So anything that's under 150 kgs needs to definitely be gaining weight, haven't developed physiologically, and they're still undergoing organ development. So it's important that we keep those animals going forward, otherwise we're at risk of stunting those animals. So if they're gaining more than 0.25 kgs a day on supplements, then we're going to have to feed them a high energy and protein diet. And there's certainly plenty of small calves that will achieve a kilo or better a day with the right nutrition. With our male animals, they weigh over 150 kgs, we can consider the implications of compensatory growth, where we can rely on a wet season to actually put that weight on the animals. But if there is a considerable time period where they might be going backwards, then we will also compromise their development. So compensatory growth in smaller animals should only be considered for really short periods of time. Some of the nutritional problems that can occur will occur if there's a lack of adequate roughage. When we start running out of pasture and we're not supplying enough roughage to those animals, we see all sorts of metabolic and digestive problems occurring, and there's no amount of supplement that we can actually provide to an animal to make up for a paddock that just hasn't got enough roughage. The intakes are phenomenally high, and it would be cost prohibitive to actually replace all of that with energy supplements. And they still have to have roughage. So they need to have good quality roughage. Small weaners absolutely need to have good quality roughage, and I'll show you a couple of photos shortly. Inadequate nutrients, starving animals, if we're not supplying adequate nutrients, and then that's basically what's happening is those animals are starving for those nutrients, and at a time where they have really high requirements for protein and energy for development physiologically and development of their digestive system and organs, imperative that we make sure their protein energy requirements are met. One of the problems that's often overlooked is the nutrient imbalances that can occur, whether that's an imbalance between minerals or an imbalance between protein and energy. So, for example, we could have plenty of energy in the diet out in the paddock, but if protein's inadequate, then those animals can't fully utilize all the energy in the diet, and it can actually induce an energy deficiency. So we really need to have our finger on the pulse on what's happening in the pasture and how the diet quality is changing at all times, particularly with very small weaners. So what to wean? I know that plenty of properties in Queensland use controlled mating, particularly as you move further east and south. So all calves should be weaned with longer mating, controlled mating. If you're mating for 5 to 6 months, then 2 weanings may be required. Otherwise, all calves should be weaned. In continuously mated herds, and particularly the northern herds, calves should be weaned down to 100 kgs at both musters, and possibly down to 80 kgs on the second muster as you're going into a particularly dry time where the diet quality is quite poor. In drought times, calves can be weaned down to 60 kgs, and provided they're given the right nutrition and good quality hay, it shouldn't have a negative impact on their growth. So what is good hay quality? And it's really important to have high quality hay for early weaners. It needs to be high in protein and energy, but particularly high in energy. Protein is easier to address by bolstering up the concentrate supplements that we feed to those weaner calves, but energy is difficult to feed, and particularly as the animals are limited as to how much matter they can actually consume in a day when they're quite small in the rumen, still developing, and they haven't got full rumen capacity. We need to make sure that not only are our grain or concentrate supplements high in protein and energy, but we also have to have high quality hay, and that's absolutely critical for developing the rumen and microbial population. It needs to be high in relative feed value. So relative feed value is an indication of potential dry matter intake of that hay, and it's governed by what we call the cell wall components of the plant cells. So the less digestible component of the plants. And if we have higher what we call NDF and ADF levels, so they represent the fiber in the diet, the higher they are, the lower the energy level is going to be in that hay, and also the less digestible, which means that the cattle can't process that hay. So it's very critical that we do have a high relative feed value so that the animals are encouraged to eat a reasonable amount of fiber. It also needs to have good color, so that's a good indication of the protein level of that feed, and good leaf attachment to the stem. So all the value is primarily found in the leaves of plants, and if we've got brittle stems and leaves are detaching, which is often common in a lot of the legume species, that leaf ends up on the ground and it gets trampled in. Even if we do have a catch, we will still get losses just in moving that hay around, putting it into hay feeders, taking strings off, that we will get leaf loss. So we want to make sure we've got good leaf attachment to the stem. And we also want a high proportion of leaf. The higher proportion of leaf we've got, the easier it is for animals to actually get the amount of roughage that they require, and it also means that we're going to get a lot less wastage because it's often the stem that gets left behind. With cereal hays, you tend to get less wastage of stem than what you do in a legume hay, for example. We also want the feed to be sweet, and particularly for very small weaners, so weaners up to about 130 kilograms. We want to have sweet hay that they're going to be attracted to and come on to quickly, because we want to develop the rumen as quickly as we can. We need to make sure there's no mold, no weeds in there. They're very vulnerable at their age to any digestive upsets. They don't have the capacity to detoxify any of those things coming into the rumen that adults do, because they haven't got the microbial populations in there to be able to do that. And just being mindful of prussic acid and nitrate levels in hays, and also the mineral levels, because they're grown in areas where there may be deficiencies or high levels of particular minerals, and so we just need to make sure that we know what those mineral levels are so that they can be balanced up correctly, and all the minerals are balanced with each other. So in that photo, you'll see that somebody's actually taking a core sample out of a hay bale. So to get hay tested, it should be taken out of 10 bales at the end of the bale. So that gives a good representation of the hay that's on offer to those animals. So this is an example of good all-around hay for all ages of weaners, except maybe baby weaners. We'd probably want to go just a little bit better, but that's some oaten hay. And then I've got another photo here, so that's high-quality hay for early weaners, and they should be able to get onto that quite readily. And when they're quite small, they might only eat about 250 grams a day initially, and they'll gradually build up their intake. So segregation of weaners, we need to segregate them because they are at various stages of rumen development, and there's also a variation in their nutrient requirements for protein and energy. And we need to ensure that there's evenness of access to feed. So it's critical that early weaners have full access to hay and concentrates, and also to prevent or minimize the amount of bullying. But we also need to be mindful that we do want to be able to transition those weaners to the heavier weight group. So I always advise my clients to look to try and maximize weight gain in those smaller weaners under 130 kgs, because their requirements are so high and it's quite expensive to feed those smaller weaners. I like to achieve the higher weight gains to transition them to the heavier weight group so that they're much more easy care, they're at less risk for disease and digestive upsets, and much cheaper to feed. And particularly for weaner heifers that are to be retained for the breeding herd, we want to make sure that they're on a positive plane of nutrition at all times so that their reliability as future breeders isn't compromised. So feeding small calves weighing between 60 to 100 kgs, we might look at feeding protein level in the vicinity of 20% and an energy level in the vicinity of 12 to 14 megajoules. It's important that for baby weaner feeds that no urea is incorporated in there. Sometimes I see a little bit of urea in some of those baby weaner feeds. It really isn't of much use to them because they haven't got a fully functional rumen at that stage. So they're much better off being fed a true protein, which is a protein that comes from a plant source. We need to make sure that there's a coccidiostat or rumen modifier in the supplements, and most of the commercial pellets and grain rations that are made, there'll be a coccidiostat incorporated into that. If you're actually making your own rations, it's important to incorporate that and ensure that it's mixed through thoroughly, because it is quite toxic if cattle consume too much. I don't recommend feeding molasses to those smaller calves. Molasses is digested very quickly in the rumen, and because the smaller calves don't have access to fiber, it is digested far too quickly and can cause digestive upsets, and potentially can lead to molasses toxicity if they're not consuming enough fiber. So they need to be introduced to really good quality hay at that stage. When they're a bit older, this is a chart that I've taken from the Weaner Management in Northern Beef Herds book, and have just looked at what animals require when the pasture quality is poor. So once those animals have actually been put out into the paddock, small calves still need to be on milk replacer, and then introduced to high quality calf meals, high quality hay, and no urea. Once they've got a little bit of age on them, so you might start to see them ruminating, regurgitating feed when they're 2 to 3 weeks old. It means that they're starting to undergo a bit of rumen development, and then once they get to 2 to 3 months of age, they will have rumen function, but they still don't have that same capacity that an adult has. They're growing rapidly, so they need to be on meals or pellets, grain mixes, and still need to be on high quality hay. We want to develop that rumen function as quickly as we can before they're turned out onto pasture. And if they're on poor quality pasture, they will need some assistance with providing roughage, which can prove to be quite expensive in areas that are located a long way from sources of hay. When they get to 100 to 150 kgs, they can start being transitioned onto more protein meals. Quality of the hay doesn't have to be quite as good, but it still needs to be reasonable. And over 150 kgs, they can be introduced to molasses. I do know that some people will introduce molasses to smaller calves and do it quite successfully without problems, but I feel it's, for my clients, I recommend that cattle don't go onto molasses until they're at least 150 kilograms, and then to ensure that there's good rumen function at that stage, and animals are going to be eating enough roughage so we don't run into any issues with molasses toxicity. So husbandry of those animals, even before we're actually looking at weaning, preparing the yards, making sure they're nice and clean, and scraping out old manure and hay, just so the animals aren't exposed to any bacteria which might cause issues, making sure there aren't any poisonous plants growing in the yard, such as button grass or pigweed, that could cause toxicity problems, keeping the dust down so animals aren't at risk of pink eye, and just ensuring troughs are cleaned. And they do need to be cleaned regularly, particularly if they're on energy supplements, because they do get fouled up quickly. And also just being mindful that the amount of space per animal is going to be greater for bigger animals than what it is for smaller weaners, and as those animals grow, they're going to require more space. It's also important to ensure there's sufficient troughing and access to feed, and I do often see where animals are queuing up to actually be able to access some of those energy supplements, and in the case of small weaners, that's something that we want to avoid, so we want to make sure that they've got enough access. So we work on about 30 centimeters per animal when it comes to feed troughs. With feeding, we want to make sure that we don't run out of feed in the yard, so they don't gorge when it's being replenished, and that often does happen, and they will gorge on those and perhaps not have enough roughage in the gut, and will run into digestive problems. Keeping all feed off the ground. I still see a lot of hay on the ground in yards, and all that does is expose animals to more potential pathogens. It increases risk of things like coccidiosis as well. So keeping the feed off the ground also prevents wastage as well. And removing the strings off hay bales. Cattle shouldn't have to fight their way into their hay. We want to make sure they've got good access and that they can actually access it in hay racks. And I do see cases where hay hasn't been pushed down into hay racks sufficiently enough for smaller cattle to actually get a good feed off of from the hay racks. Removing sick animals and non-feeders and non-doers. If an animal is a shy feeder when it's undergoing weaning, it's going to follow through to an adult, and they become a liability in dry times, so they need to be identified and removed from the herd because they'll just be taking up space in the paddock and not actually forming. And keeping records of what's actually being fed and when it's being fed, so it doesn't run out in yards, when the waters have been cleaned, any illnesses in treatments, animal weights and weight changes, so animals can be transitioned into other groups, and also to record how much it's costing for each kilo of weight gain while the animals are in the yards and also out in the paddock. And just keeping up the yard maintenance and animal health treatment so everybody's on the same page, particularly for stations where there are a number of staff that are actually involved in the weaning process and maintaining those weaners. And it does give you a trace back then if animals become ill, what the potential reasons might be. And sometimes we jump to conclusions about what it might be when sometimes there's symptoms that are common to a number of different diseases. So being able to trace it back through records is often quite helpful. And some of the issues, potential issues, obviously, are worms and lice. When animals are nutritionally stressed, they're more susceptible to worms, so doing a worm egg count and getting a larval culture done, so you're just drenching animals for the specific worms that they've got high burdens of, and treating for lice where required. And then on entry into the yard, it's good policy to give those animals a 5-in-1 vaccination when animals transition from a poor quality diet, which they could potentially be on even if they're on milk on their mothers, and they go to a lush feed. They're coming out of dry times, they might not have been getting enough milk, and if they're finding themselves on a high quality diet, it does set it up for things like enterotoxemia and also vitamin B1 deficiency with the abrupt changes in the rumen, not allowing the microbial environment to adapt to that. So transitioning some of those older animals slowly is important. So maybe providing a little bit, some drier hay along with some of the better quality hay initially, just while the rumen microbial environment adapts, is pretty important. And minimizing the risk of coccidiosis, so having a rumen modifier in supplements and ensuring animals aren't nutritionally stressed at any given time. So smaller animals tend to be much more susceptible than older animals do. Pink eye is a problem if we've got dust in yards or fly. Ensuring that there's good hygiene in the yards and meeting animals' nutrient requirements and easing them onto high starch supplements slowly will help to minimize the risk of some of those potential diseases from manifesting. So once they're out in the paddock, now what do? We still need to make sure that their requirements are being met. And their requirements, so the key nutrients, are ensuring they're getting enough energy, protein, enough phosphorus if you're living in the north. Further down in southern areas, calcium might be an issue, particularly if you're on temperate grass pastures. So we need to make sure we've got a good balance of those two. In more northern areas, calcium tends to be much higher in the diet relative to phosphorus, so we need to address that and make sure that they're in balance as well. And we also want to ensure we've got good intake of pasture. The more pasture they're consuming, the more energy and protein that they're getting. And that's why we want to develop that rumen quickly, so we can transition those smaller animals and develop their rumen so we can actually increase their intake of pasture once they're actually put out into the paddock. So at the moment, there's plenty of areas where we're looking at just dry grass and stalks and also dry stalks. So in the case of breeders, they're nowhere near meeting their requirement, hence the need to actually pull those calves off younger. But those calves also require more than just an energy supplement. If we're talking about calves that are 130 kgs and younger, for example, they'll need to be assisted with some good quality roughage in addition to an energy supplement to maintain a good weight gain. As they become heavier, they'll require much less assistance. So the faster we can can transition them, the better. So protein's usually the first to become deficient in the diet, and it's relatively inexpensive if we feed animals start early. Younger growing stock have much higher requirements for protein. And as you can see with this graph, it's come from the Nutrition Edge workshop notes. That broken line is what the microbes supply to the animal, provided they're getting enough fiber, so the microbes have a requirement for fiber. And you can see that animals that are fully developed, those microbes can meet their protein requirements, but quite young animals, as depicted by that line on the far left-hand side, have protein requirements well beyond what those microbes can supply them with. So we need to make sure that we provide them with a true protein source coming from plant-based feeds, whether that's from the paddock or whether that's from supplements. Once they get older, we can start to supplement them with urea and replace some of that protein requirement. Energy is generally the last to become deficient, and when that happens, we get onset of rapid weight loss. It's expensive to supplement, and if we have a lack of pasture, we're going to run into a significant energy deficiency, and we can't make up for that by feeding grains and energy concentrates. We need to supply roughage to those animals because their intake is considerable. So spoiling rain and frost will certainly rapidly reduce the energy content in feeds, particularly on tropical grass pastures, and animals will have very high nutritional requirements for energy when that occurs. We need to also be mindful of water intake because animals are processing huge volumes of roughage and feed. We need to make sure there's enough water going into the rumen to actually facilitate that process of microbial digestion. So getting an analysis done in your bore water to check out the pH and also the chemical properties to determine what their potential water intake will be, and also how that will affect the overall mineral status of the animals. So things like high temperatures will make animals drink more. If animals are walking out further, they're going to have higher water requirements. So it's important that water is clean so that animals can drink as much as they require. And it's also important to ensure that water troughs are clean and we remove all the algae as well. So just a couple of slides to wrap up. I'm conscious of the time. We need to segregate weaners into weight groups for preferential feeding. Baby weaners have high requirements for protein and energy, but they also have a low intake because they've got limited rumen capacity while it's developing, and also limited microbial numbers to actually process that feed. So we need to also consider what other available options we have, because once we embark on feeding early weaners, as you probably are aware of your own experiences, it is quite expensive, and we don't want to just do a half job. We're better off, doing a good job and getting a good return on investing a few extra dollars, rather than sort of going in there with half effort and not getting a good result. Ensuring good access to good quality hay and roughage, and being able to procure that hay when there's plenty of good quality hay on the market at cheap prices, and stockpiling that. If you know when you're likely to wean most years, just having that on hand a few months early to take advantage of lower prices. And even looking at forward contracting other commodities, so things like cottonseed for older weaners, they can be forward contracted on today's prices, and you don't pay until you take delivery of those things. Can help to reduce your feeding costs. Making changes in the diet slowly to allow the rumen to adjust is critical, otherwise we run into metabolic and digestive problems. Choosing supplements that are most cost effective, so we should be doing our calculations on an energy and protein basis rather than doing comparisons on a tonnage basis. And finally, we need to continue to meet their requirements once they're out into the paddock, and ensure that there's enough readily available roughage for those animals, and just monitoring the diet quality, using the correct supplement group, monitoring animal performance, and ensuring that, if we are feeding early weaner heifers, that they continue to gain weight during that entire duration from weaning to mating. Otherwise, we will compromise their reliability as replacement breeders, in which case we'd be better off either to sell them or just run them as stores.